Thanks for inviting me. Like Wally said, I was supposed to talk about colonialism and corruption and maybe other things too, but last night when I was thinking about what to say, it got to be a bit too much and I cut out the corruption part. But I think you've already got a little bit of a taste of what plantations and corruption, how they go together, just from Philip's presentation when he talked about what's happened with FSC and the conflicts of interest with FSC, which is supposed to be making sure that plantations are environmentally responsible and sustainable. So I'll make it easier on myself by not talking about corruption and just talking a little bit about colonialism. And don't believe Wally, I don't really know much about colonialism, but trying to learn bit by bit, year by year, and I'll just share a few of the thoughts that I had about it in connection with plantations. Plantations. The other day we had another session in another room in the university, and some of my friends and I were talking to a Nigerian colleague. I guess he's not here now. Nigerian colleague who is a researcher here at KwaZulu-Natal at the university. And we were talking about the word plantations. And he said, you know, when I was a child in Nigeria and we went to school, what we learned about was that plantations were this thing that happened over there in the Caribbean, you know, maybe a few centuries ago, where these Europeans came in and they had slaves and they had these mass production projects on the land where they drove the slaves to produce things like sugarcane in the Caribbean and in Brazil and in other places. And this is what he associated the word plantations with. And it made me think, he's right, and the schools in Nigeria were right. This is where the word plantations got started. This is what plantations were all about at the beginning. And of course it wasn't only work in the fields, it was work in preparing the cane and so forth. And it made me realize, yeah, traditionally plantations are an organization of nature that goes together with colonialism and slavery. And to a certain extent, this continues today in places like northeastern Brazil, and Dominican Republic, where people are so much in debt that they're forced to work basically just to survive without any pay. So the slavery in some sense continues even today in plantations. So there's this long-standing connection between plantations and colonialism and slavery. So yeah, I mean, this connection between plantations and colonialism and slavery is not a complete accident. It just didn't happen to be, unluckily, the case that plantations are connected with slavery. There's an economic logic here. For example, look at a different example, cotton plantations and slavery in the southern United States. There was an economic logic to this. It was connected with the development of these, for example, textile mills in Manchester, in England, at the time. Textile mills driven, by the way, by fossil fuels, by machines which were made possible by fossil fuels, which, as we know today, are responsible for a lot of things, including climate change. Anyway, these machines required a large amount of uniform raw material. And there were other machines connected with this, like the machine at the bottom is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. And these things were all connected with, the new machines were connected with the need to attack a new frontier and to have new large-scale production of the raw material, which was cotton. And that was connected at the time with slavery as the best way of exploiting labor with this particular land formation, with this particular technology. So I think we can say that colonialism is, in a sense, in the nature of plantations, and plantations are one of the ways that colonialism organizes nature. But I think we also have to remember that, you know, these connections between societies and their technologies and their political organization and what we call nature, this doesn't just happen with plantations and colonialism. Every forest in the world, I feel pretty confident in saying, is dependent on and has been shaped by and has been reshaped by the human society that lives with, through, and in and around that forest. Every forest is connected with some human society. So I think just as other kinds of just as the plantations are connected with colonialism, other kinds of social organization, for example, forest commons regimes, are in the nature of certain kinds of other forests, like biodiverse forests. And biodiverse forests are one of the ways that what I call commoners can organize nature, just as colonialism organizes nature into plantations, for example. Australia, for example. Australian forests for tens of thousands of years have been shaped by human beings through fire, through all kinds of ways of managing the forest to make it beneficial to the Australian human beings. So there's this connection there as well. The North American, this is something like the North American forest mosaic that the first Europeans found when they came to North America. And of course, some of them thought, oh, this is nature. This is untouched nature without human beings. No, of course not. This is not an empty nature. This is a nature which was deliberately shaped and cultivated and nourished and changed by the Native Americans who lived there. So that's a different kind of relationship. This is a famous example from the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, where people have formed and shaped and nourished a different kind of forest. When the Europeans came to this area, and actually many Europeans today still think, oh, you know, these people who live there in this region south of the Sahara, they're destroying the forest. You know, they're using it for firewood. Oh my God. When you look around, all you see left are these little bitty islands of forest, and the desert's coming on, and soon the desert will take over. That's what they saw. That's what the Europeans saw. But then people started looking a little more closely at the history, and they started talking to the villagers, they talking to the people who lived there, and they found out actually the reasons those islands of forest are there was because people put them there. It's because the villagers actually nourished them and helped them to make them grow. And they looked at the history, and they looked at the old aerial photographs from the 1940s, and they looked at old histories from the 19th century, and they concluded that these forest islands were actually growing because there were more people there to take care of them. So this is another relationship between forest and human beings, which is very different from the relationship between colonialism and plantations. Anyway, so a lot of our friends, we've had this slogan for a long time: plantations are not forests. And it's a good slogan, and I like it, and I've used it. But there is a slight difficulty with the slogan, in that sometimes the slogan seems to imply that the difference between plantations and forests is the difference between a human entangled and a non-human entangled organization of nature, rather than one between different kinds of human entangled organizations. After all, the distinction between these plantations and these different kinds of forest is not just a distinction between various vegetable items, but it's also a social and political and technological distinction between the different societies that work in and through and around those forests. For example, when we look at these pictures, what we should see is not just different ways of organizing trees. We should see the difference between colonialism at the top and commons at the bottom. We should see human beings, not just trees. To focus in a little bit more carefully on contemporary tree plantations, the question is, what other social and political and technological structures and relations can we see when we look at them? For example, this is an Australian forest. This is a pulp plantation. This is a eucalyptus plantation. Well, or this is a tree plantation for pulpwood. It might not look like it, but actually it is, because one of the main technological features of this system are these huge pulp and paper machines. Enormous machines that produce huge amounts of paper and require constant amounts of uniform raw material to feed them day and night. Why? Because they're expensive and they're big. And if you let them stop for even 24 hours, you lose your money, you lose your investment, you can't pay back the banks. It's necessary to have this constant supply of raw material. What does that mean? Number one, it means big areas of land. It means colonial practices, colonial takeover of land. Number two, it means uniform trees. You see the equation at the top. You have to have all the same trees to give yourself uniform raw material. In fact, not just the same species, you need the same variety. Maybe even the same kind of clones. Maybe even genetically identical trees. Maybe even genetically engineered trees, like Anne was talking about earlier. And at the bottom, who are the humans? Who are the humans in this system? Who are the humans in this plantation? Well, as you know, the pulp and paper industry is one of the most capital-intensive industries there is. There are not many employees. There's just a little person over there on the right. So you can see there's a big difference between this and the forest I showed earlier from Australia. Here is an agrofuel plantation. This might be a palm oil plantation, for example. And these are the main features of a plantation from a certain point of view. There's no trees in the picture, but this is a picture of a plantation, part of the system that makes the plantation system work. Again, there's just a little person there, because the people are very unimportant in this system. What's important are the huge, hungry machines, which are required to produce more and more in order to make the profits. And of course the cars and whatever. 400, what does that figure mean? Well, that's an interesting number and an important number when we're talking about agrofuel plantations. I think some of the other speakers have mentioned this problem. What are agrofuels for? Agrofuels are to replace oil. And in fact, another good picture of an agrofuel plantation would be an oil well, because an oil well symbolizes the social structure which organizes palm oil plantations for agrofuels, because the trees are a replacement for oil. So what does that mean? Well, I think other speakers have already mentioned this, but it means that, for example, you're asking plants, you're asking land, you're asking trees to provide you with a substitute for something which it has taken millions of years to make underneath the ground. Every year we burn up the equivalent of 400 years of plant growth in oil. 400 has another interesting meaning. If we were going to offer a substitute for all of the world's oil through trees or through plants, we would need 400 times the area of plantations we have today. So I don't know how to estimate that in terms of this room, but say maybe say maybe just the area around this podium is the area under plantations today. To replace the oil, we would need to colonize the entire room, at least, in order to replace the oil. Again, colonialism is in the nature of plantations. It's not just a little side effect or something optional, it's in the nature of plantations. Today, of course, we have a new thing. We have carbon plantations, which are supposed to help solve climate change. Instead of producing oil, instead of producing paper, trees are supposed to produce carbon. So today we have this production line, mass production line, of what they call CO2 reductions. And this is what the people down in Durban are talking about in the official United Nations meetings every day. Is how do we produce carbon dioxide reductions? And how do we produce them in the most efficient economic way? How do we mass produce them? Like a paper machine produces masses of paper, or like an agro-fuel refinery produces masses of fuel. How do we produce masses of carbon dioxide reductions cheaply at the lowest price? Well, gosh, if you go down to somewhere like South Africa, maybe you can get some land pretty cheaply, and maybe you can grow some trees pretty cheaply, and maybe you can say that those trees are carbon dioxide reductions, and you can mass produce carbon dioxide reductions and sell them in that way. And this is the equation that underlies the whole idea, is that CO2 is CO2 everywhere. The molecules are chemically exactly the same, so why can't we get some cheap CO2 molecules from trees? And we buy them, and we allow that to license continually burning the fossil fuels that are underneath the ground. Okay, and here again, the whole point is productivity, high productivity. Volume, high production, speed, and accumulation. This picture is from a famous old US movie with Charlie Chaplin, the famous comedian, called Modern Times. I don't know when it was made, 20s or 30s? I'm not sure, I can't remember. But it was a satire on this industrial system that destroys people, destroys laborers. Charlie Chaplin playing a laborer here. But we shouldn't forget that what happens to human beings in this system of endless production and overproduction also happens to nature. The trees are also pushed by this system, and everything that depends on the trees are pushed by this system. So I think the title that people were asking me to talk about was industrial plantations and how they prop up colonialism. But I would say that industrial plantations don't prop up colonialism. They're constituted by colonialism. And when we look at a plantation, we can see colonialism, as well as by overaccumulation, overproduction, financialization, and many other social things. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.